Okay, so hello there. My name is Scott Phillips. I'm the president and CEO of Starfish Medical and the host of your webinar today, and I'll be performing the interview of our very special guest, Amr Salahieh. Just as we get going, let me give you a little bit of background of the playbook. The Medical Device Playbook is a conference we've been running real live for the last 6-7 years, and normally we run them in a couple of cities, Vancouver and Toronto, and you can tell by the pictures, we normally have around 200 people or so. We have speakers from all over North America. They've been quite impactful. We're really excited to put them on every year. And of course, under COVID, we've been forced to make them virtual. And lo and behold, they've been more popular than ever. In fact, we've gone monthly rather than annual. And we've brought some really remarkable speakers in. And we get the luxury of doing a little bit specialty topics. So keep an eye on what topics go by, and if something catches your eye, then we'd be totally happy to have you attend and have access. So a tiny bit of background: who is Starfish Medical? Why do we do this? We're a medical device development firm headquartered in Victoria, Canada, with significant development and manufacturing operations in Toronto as well. And we probably one of the top 10 companies in our field. Serve companies around North America, principally serving the US market, but also Canada, a little bit of Europe, a little bit of Asia. So that's our background. We work for companies like this. You recognize a number of these names, a mix of sort of larger corporates and specific startups. So, and we tend to develop things that look sort of like this. So things that are beautiful, they're functional, they have a high technology component, so we have a very heavy technology development aspect to our company. That gives you a bit of context. So let's get into pardon me. Let's get into the show for today. I'm delighted that Amr has agreed to come on the show for us. I think he could be the most prolific serial medtech entrepreneur active today, and he's got a particular focus in cardiovascular devices. If you take a look at his website, shifamed.com, you'll have an idea of just how broad he goes. And we'll get into a number of his companies. He started early on companies like Robotic Medical and embolic protection, moved into heart valves, moved into catheters, moved into renal denervation. He's done all sorts of different things. And he's currently got 7 companies in his portfolio. And he's raising more than $100 million a year for these companies. It's turned it into a machine, and it's totally admirable and just remarkable. So I think what we're hoping to get at today is, how did he get that way, and what's the essence of this? And maybe you can learn a few lessons and insights that will help you with your medical device. So welcome, Amr, to our show today.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and love to be part of your endeavors all the time, Scott.
Thank you, Amr. I think you and I have known each other for about 7 years or so, and sure, you've even come up to Vancouver and spoken for us before. So I'm delighted to be able to show you to a larger audience outside of Vancouver. So can you, as we get going, can you tell us a little bit, you're an engineer, but so how did you decide to go into engineering, and how did you pick medical?
Well, I was, first I wanted to be different from the rest of my family. I didn't want to go into sort of being a merchant or that kind of thing. I did have one uncle who was who was an engineer, was doing development of building housing developments. But I wanted to be different from that as well. So I was thinking of being a physician, but I did have this engineering sort of interest, and my pre-med was biomedical engineering that I did at Case Western in Cleveland, but quickly realized I was really not cut out to be a physician. So I stuck with the biomedical engineering because I really liked the idea of caring for people, healthcare in general, and engineering, of course. And I stuck with it, and I really never changed. So that's really how I got into the space. It's the idea of being different, but also trying to help people in healthcare in general.
Interesting. And engineering is a bit of a calling. You don't necessarily realize that you're an engineer. At least that was my experience. I didn't have engineers in my family. So what was it that called to you about engineering?
I was always interested to see how the closest thing that I was able to witness was really, when buildings were going up, I was fascinated by what it took to put a building together and how, we would have buildings that are being built in Beirut where I grew up. And it was always really interesting to me how all the machines and the people and how every level went up, every few weeks. So that was really early interest of mine, and I was always interested. I got really interested in sailing early on, and I built my own little tiny, with a plastic bottle sailboat type thing. And that just gave me a sense of accomplishment and just sort of linking things together that really interested me. So I would say those are the kinds of things that I was exposed to, and I sort of maintained that interest in general.
Great. So as you graduated in 1989, and I graduated in 1989 too, so I remember it was not a really great employment market at the time. So, and you got into a company, I believe, called Advanced Cardiovascular Systems. Can you tell me about what that was like and what you learned in that environment?
ACS at the time had become part of Eli Lilly. Eli Lilly had acquired ACS. ACS, one of the pioneers of angioplasty catheters. It had been acquired sort of a couple of years before I joined them. And it had been one of the most successful medical device company. And I'd say it sort of set the stage for our industry. There was an industry in Southern California about valves, but valves don't tend to move very fast. It's an implant, and testing for that requires many, many sort of cycles, and you don't really change a new design every year. What ACS did, and the success of ACS, one of the first companies to exceed $200 million in revenue in less than 5 years. Back then, it was a really big deal. And products were being launched every 12 to 18 months and totally obsoleting the original product. And it was an invasive product, it was a really important kind of a product. But it sort of set the stage of single-use, invasive, minimally invasive products that were sort of life-saving. And that was really what I joined. And at the time, certainly, there was still a lot of startup culture permeating throughout the building. And very quickly, it was, we would hear on the intercom, people would sort of say, hey, Smith Johnson, pick up extension 101. And every once in a while, you would hear, Bob Dole, whatever, gone. And so I asked people, what does that mean? And they said, well, he's no longer part of the company. Well, what happened? Did they let him go? No, he left, but I thought he was really good. Well, he left to join a startup or to do his own startup. So that really certainly reinforced in my mind that interest of always going on to new ventures. And that's how ACS was. It was about the people who started the company, the success they had, and all these other people who were leaving to start other companies in Silicon Valley. They were all medical device companies. For these people leaving ACS, that's what they would do. And then, clearly successes started to come through from the people who had left. So I always started looking at joining a startup every time I finished a project. And I really wasn't able to do that until about 6 years later.
And over those 6 years, you advanced fairly rapidly, became a team leader. So does that mean you got out of the detailed technical design fairly early in your career?
Well, I never really got out of the technical design. I started as an engineer and engineering manager. We had to do a lot of things because I was one of the first employees. So we had to put multiple hats on, but the engineering sort of knowledge and being involved and being able to move a project forward was always there, and sort of being part of the decision making or driving the design decisions was always still part of a lot of what I do. It certainly is less detailed day to day today, but it really never leaves you, because the things that I've continued to do is really be part of this early phase of the innovation, the creation of what a product should look like and how you design it and what it should do. So I don't want to be too separate from that, because really that's the most fun part as far as I'm concerned.
I think that's kind of one of the essences of what we're talking about here today. How do you navigate to find the way you can be most effective as you sort of develop these new companies? So I believe you had one of your managers in one of your earlier companies that really inspired you with his development philosophy.
Certainly. So Chuck Taylor was my first boss, and he's the one who sort of hired me into ACS. I was a student intern. I was dying to get a job, dying to get a green card, and that was sort of my foot in the door. And Chuck was really a remarkable person. He had dropped out from Brown College and he went and built his own home in Arkansas. But he was very fascinated with technology. He was an artisan of sorts, incredibly well educated and intellectual, and surrounded himself and the team that we were working on together with PhDs, people who had a ton of experience. He was younger than all of them, but I was still younger than any of them, and we were doing some really interesting things and pushing the edge of the technology. And working as a group, multidisciplinary group. Every person on the team was bringing something else. And he spent a lot of time explaining to people and teaching people what we're doing and why. So it was a very hands-on approach of interacting with the team members and being involved with a lot of what's going on, so that together as a cohesive team, we'd get to the next step and the next milestone. So it was a very interesting sort of exposure for me that I think I've incorporated a lot of that into what I do today.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about that, whether the idea of this sort of the very practically minded Renaissance engineer, is that an important idea for you?
Well, certainly. I mean, not necessarily everybody is going to do everything. There's people who have more experience in some things than the other, but I think to me, a really important idea is to have together a team where different people are bringing different things to the table, but have it work really close together. And then even I would rather have more confined space than less, so that people talk to each other on lunch breaks or in the hallways, and then they develop personal relationships. Because I think those kinds of things make a big difference. And that people are also interested in understand and respect each other for what where the expertise lies. That respect and mutual respect is really critical to really good behavior sort of teams. And when people are able to share their philosophies, their hobbies, their interests in general, the whole thing goes a long ways. And when there's tough times, they can support each other. And it really has helped us over the years. It's not just about the immediate task at hand, but it's beyond that. So I really try to, as much as possible, create these interconnected teams where people interact with each other at work, but also outside of work if possible. And they also learn about other things and what other things people are doing and what the other projects are. So that's another thing that we try to foster. We do want people to be focused. We want their compensation to be related to their actions, not somebody else's actions. But we also want them to be exposed to other things that are going on. So we're fortunate enough within Shifamed, we have a portfolio approach. So we have the people being exposed and being aware of what else is going on. Where is cutting edge of heart pumps? What's the cutting edge of mitral valves? And people sort of interacting with each other on that level. Not necessarily they're going to go and work on that project, but maybe they can give them a hint. Hey, we learned something here. You guys should be aware of this. Oh, or I have a problem here. I know you're an expert in this. Can you help us out with it?
On the line of team respect, I've noticed my own experience that the very innovative people and the very sort of the finishers, the people who take pride in getting the job done, don't tend to respect each other that much, but they're both necessary to the whole endeavor. What's your experience with that?
It is critical, and so one of the ways that we're doing it is we bring people that are in general passionate about what they're doing. You have to have this common passion, and that becomes the thing that glues everybody together. And we tend to bring people that are more technically oriented anyways, and people who are absolutely passionate about healthcare. I don't think you're going into medical devices if you don't have that sort of interest, that deep motivation. And so I think that is sort of one of the ways we've dealt with it. So, and we tend to have people. We don't have, when we're working on teams. There's not, I do management and therefore I don't do these other things. We are in general looking for hands-on people that if they need to step in and do any sort of tasks to advance the cause. And at times they do things that are not necessarily, they wouldn't do in a big company. That really is part of the culture and certainly the startup culture.
That's great. I've got a ton of questions I'd love to ask.
One other really critical person for me as a mentor is also Fred Pastrami. I was meaning to talk about him as well. He has been really critical for me. He's the person I sold my first company to him. And together we've worked on a number of companies and we've had a number of successes together. But his insight, more on the business side, is still very technical because he's also an R&D person by nature. But his insight about how to handle strategy, business, fundraising, a lot of employee type issues and so forth has been instrumental. And just also watching him and his organization, Incept, and how they've done things. Certainly, we've taken a lot of things in how he's done it with his partner, Amr Salahieh, and adapted a lot of what they've done and done things a little bit differently. So.
Can you tell us a couple of stories about how he's been useful to you?
Well, it's mostly stories of how we've done things together. I mean, I'll give you an example. We in our first company together, EPI, we built a device. We built this filter. It's an embolic protection filter. And we were sort of tough on ourselves, trying to do it really with the least amount of money. Started in the house. Got involved with physicians really early on and really brought him in really close to us. That was really, he's done that, I would say, more than most. And that was an early lesson where we would bring the luminaries and get them involved, even if they were working potentially for a competitor. That didn't matter. They were too important for us not to really get really involved with us. And not just one or two, but get really deep, why should we do this? Why is the design? What's the motivation? What's really important? So that they're really part of the process from the very beginning. We certainly continue to do this today. And then also, when we finally built the first clinical lot, Fred himself went to Colombia at the time, and he intended to do like one case for this filter to use it to do it like a carotid stenting and he ended up, the first case worked great, and he ended up doing like literally every part of the body where you could use this filter. He used it. It was in the heart, it was in the brain, it was for the kidneys, it was for the peripherals, and it was also a time when there was bombs going off in Colombia and stuff like that. So that whole experience, and in a matter of a couple of days, did a bunch of cases that really propelled the company from where we were to where ultimately we got sold to Boston Scientific within a short order.
Yeah, that was a remarkable story, embolic protection. And was that your company? Did you found that company?
So I had a consulting firm, and Fred and I worked, Fred was thinking, look, we need somebody to design this. He was on his own. He had left the first company he had started, Endotex, and he needed support. And I had a consulting organization, I had a team. We were all working in the house. So our team is the one that designed that product. And we continued to work on it. And over a period of time, that project became sort of the most important project amongst all the activities that we were conducting it was a engineering consulting firm that we had. We had now moved out of the house. We had our facilities and gotten certification and all that kind of stuff. And then at one point in time, it was so good and so interesting that he was raising money, and he had a choice. He could do the normal thing, which is to hire people one at a time, and put the company together that way, or buy us, because that was our team, that was our project, we were dedicated. And he managed to convince these VCs that a small company, a startup company that only had a few $1 million, a handful, buy another small company and accelerate things. And they, to the credit of Fred and Rob Cooling, who was who was the VC at onset, he succeeded. They agreed to this, and that was my first sale to EPI, to Fred.
All right.
And so all my employees became EPI employees, and a year later, Boston Scientific buys the organization.
And did you take equity or did you take dollars?
I did. That was probably one of the most difficult things for me. Is I had total control. I was really enjoying the ability to move quickly, to make decisions fast, and to really make progress and work on a number of things. And so I had to sort of take a leap of, a change of mindset. I had all this control, and I had a lot of rewards coming from, we had grown, we had pretty good revenue at the time. For me, it was a lot of money. And certainly the future looked bright. But it was clear also that I wasn't going to be able to do what I could do if I were to team up with Fred, even though I was going to end up with a much smaller sort of percentage of the new company. So I did take equity, and that really turned out to be a good, a big success that I certainly was hoping for, but it certainly wasn't guaranteed. And I had to sort of give up all this control for a different path to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad I did, because it really changed how I moved on after that.
Yeah, and I believe that exited around 2001. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah, and then you actually stayed with Boston Sci for a while.
Yeah, so that I stayed on with Boston Scientific for a couple of years after that acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a really interesting learning experience, taking a product to commercial, and getting introduced to what a sales team would look like and all that kind of stuff. So that was also developed new relationships that were pretty important to us, namely sort of a very deep relationship with Dr. Don Baim. That was also important to us and for the future ventures. That was going from the big company to a startup, then our own startup, and then back to a big company, and that cycle and that learning is very useful. There's no question about that.
Mm-hmm. So these days, it seems like universities all have entrepreneurship programs. They encourage other students to go out and start companies, and but that's kind of in conflict with the data of successful entrepreneurs that seem to have a lot of corporate experience. I'm curious what your thought is, whether it's beneficial to get someone else to pay you early in your career, or whether it'd be better to just dive in.
I think it depends on the circumstances. I don't think there's a singular formula in my mind on this. I think if there's a really interesting opportunity and you can be part of a startup and you're interested in startups in general, jump right in. When the opportunity sort of presents itself for someone to now be part of a bigger company because of an acquisition or some other ways, take advantage of that as well. In my mind, staying in one big entity or it's just one thing is probably the thing that I would recommend the least. Being able to switch and learn and create different networks and be part of the different networks is really what's valuable. And then being exposed to different environments, small and big, and bureaucracy or lack of bureaucracy, chaos, and so forth. I think that really helps people to really make the right choices as they move on. So I don't think you have to get the corporate experience up front. I think it's really important to take advantage of it when it presents itself. It can happen later. I think circumstance would dictate what's the right thing to do.
Right. So you've had this benefit of great mentorship, which you actually sought out, being pretty bold in selling your company and so on when you could have just carried on, early corporate experience. So I think those are all kind of magical ingredients from what I see in different companies or in successful entrepreneurs. So I believe your next venture after that was Sadrak. Can you talk about how you decided to get out of Boston Sci and how you decided to get into another interventional company like that?
Yeah, I mean, I was quite happy at Boston. Boston treated us well. We had done well with them. They had really, the way they did EPI and that integration was quite successful. Fred was very instrumental in making sure that we were protected and so forth. And I was actually afraid of getting too comfortable and growing deep roots within a large organization like that. So I sort of made the deliberate effort of quitting. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, but I had started to see what was going on with percutaneous valves, and I said, I'm going to start one of those kinds of companies. And went to the house again and started that process. And of course, at the beginning, I was by myself, and I started having some engineers come work with me as consultants, and started to talk to people and see if they could help me with some funding. So I went to angel investors. I went to physicians. I went to distributors that had worked with us, people that knew me and what we had done. I went to Fred, and that really allowed us to raise a little bit of money and put it together, an idea. And I was trying to leverage what I thought I was, what I was good at, which is more, catheter-based things, and also more to the technology aspects. And I said, let's solve a difficult problem and come up with an interesting solution, trying to sort of leapfrog what at the time PVT was doing. And PVT was what became, what today is Edwards. And they got acquired by Edwards and became the percutaneous valve for Edwards Life Sciences. So they were what I was looking for. I was looking and seeing, we could probably do better. And there's also another company called Core Valve that was doing a very, the same thing essentially. And I was watching both of those companies and saying there has to be also a better way to do this. And so that's what we, me and the team endeavored to do. Ultimately funded the company and moved on.
Now, at this time, you had roughly 11 years of experience in interventional cardiology type applications. How critical do you think that was in you being able to raise capital?
Oh, it was essential. The experience and being able to first feel confident that we could do this and not just be assuming it, and also engaging with, the investors. I mean, the investors that helped me at the beginning, they were not my uncle and cousin. They were from the industry, and that in and of itself was, I'd say, helpful, but also gave us more credibility, and gave me confidence that these people that I respect certainly are taking us seriously. That was pretty important, and certainly it helps when you're fundraising.
And what was the big idea of Sadra, just for our audience?
So Sadra, what we saw is that placing a valve, certainly at the time, was not so easy. The placement of the valve has to be within millimeters. If you go too far up, and you'd be against the coronaries, and if you deploy the valve against the coronaries, you'd kill the patients on the spot. And if you were too low, you would affect the AV node. You'd have electrical issues for the patient, and other obstructions of the other side of the heart. So you really didn't have a lot of maneuvering space. And we said to ourselves, well, let's give it an undo command. Let's make it so that you can deploy the valve, percutaneously. But if it was not in the right place, you could go back and reposition it. So that was sort of, I would say, the basic principle. The other sort of fundamental thing that we saw is that in the early stage, there was a lot of leakage. When they placed the valves, there was not enough of a seal around the valve. And that was something that we sort of honed in sort of right away and started putting energy around how do you solve. Those were the two key problems that we were trying to attend to.
Mm-hmm. And what sort of results did you get once you rolled it out in your testing internally and in clinically?
Well, the repositionability is still one of the key features of this valve. I mean, the valve is called Lotus valve. It's being sold by Boston Scientific, and it is one of the key advantages that it has. And the sealing is also what this device has. I mean, it sealed really well, even from those two features did work as we were hoping they would, even in literally the very first patient we did have. And the sealing approaches and the emphasis on that has taken off, not just within Lotus, but also Edwards has adapted some of those ideas into their designs and so forth.
So you've been influential beyond even your direct product.
Yeah, well, this was an interesting thing. We were deathly afraid of being sued, and so we always had to navigate around the IP landmines, right? We had to avoid infringing other people's patents. And PVT Edwards, they had a lot of ways to protect what they were doing, and it was not easy for us to sort of separate ourselves. And so we spent a lot of time and money doing this. Ultimately succeeded and got our own patents, and never expected that actually Boston would successfully sue Edwards. And only a couple of years ago or last year, I got involved in that lawsuit, and Boston Scientific prevailed on that one. And that was kind of an interesting experience in and of itself. But certainly didn't expect that. We were always afraid of being the one to be sued. It turned out that what we generated, became an aggressive sort of.
And was that based on your IP that you'd conceived?
Yeah, it was really all about that sealing feature that I was describing.
Amazing. Can you talk a little bit about the exit process with Boston Sci, how you went about picking the right partner and what the discussions were?
Because I had been at Boston, they were investors. And I continued to maintain those relationships. I mean, that is one of the advantages of being part of a big company, certainly at times. And so you have to take advantage of that. And so I got them involved in the Series B. So they were part of the Series B. And I also continued to try to talk to other strategics. And, a couple of them got close to being the acquirers. I mean, ultimately, that acquisition really was executed by Fred and Ken. I had left by then. I started Shifamed. But you always try to do, and we always try to do is, to the extent that you can, is to establish an option, so that you maximize the benefit. That's really, for your investors and yourself. That's what you attempt to do. But there are circumstances, and certainly we've done that a couple of different times, where it's obvious that there's the one likely acquirer, and you want to sort of move forward with goodwill and efficiency, and you sort of come to the conclusion that if that's what we want to do, we can facilitate and speed the process and do an acquisition and a conversation mostly with one, and based on the understanding that, look, if you're gonna treat us right early, then we won't go ahead and establish the auction, and therefore we can quickly sort of conclude this transaction. If, on the other hand, there are times when you really want to push for the auction situation. So the auction or the ability to do an auction is essential. It sometimes allows you to have a singular conversation, or sometimes you execute an auction. But it gives you the ability to not be so out of control. It gives you some level of control to do what's right, and to be true early. And that's a really important ingredient for success.
And to what extent, when you were conceiving the problem and how you'd approach it, were you also thinking about who would buy it later?
Especially today, I'm not going to tell you that, back when we did, EPI and what we did, Sadra, we had this is present in our minds, but it's pretty clear to me that some of the reasons that we've been successful is that we had a set of buyers, not just one. And those buyers are competitive with each other, which allows you to sell a company pre-commercialization, pre-FDA approval. And today for us, that has become a mantra, right? We look for areas and spaces where an acquisition can take place, because we know that dynamic exists. So we will try to avoid areas where there's one dominant player, because it's really hard to drive an auction, and it's very hard for an acquirer, if they're dominant and they know nobody else is going to come and step up, for them to really make a lot of concessions.
Yeah.
And so that is, for us, in terms of how we conduct things, actually a starting point. If we don't even go forward to development and company and technology, if those ingredients don't exist from the very beginning.
That's brilliant. So I think that's a major insight as well that you kind of come to over time, but now it guides you a lot, right?
That's right.
So you, in 2007, you sold Sadra, and it was roughly a 10-year period before your next two major exits that both happened very similar times. Can you briefly, before we get into the sort of the latest portfolio approach, can you tell us a little bit about that period?
Well, I think there's maybe a miscommunication. So we sold Sadra in 2010, I believe, or 11.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Sadra took a while to do the exit. I left Sadra in 2008,
Okay.
2007, 2008, and started what became Shifamed at that point in time. And this was quite a difficult time. This was during the financial crisis. And we went back to the house for the third time and started to figure out, what are we going to work on next? So that was, we started looking at obesity for a while. And then after like a year's worth of work on it, decided it was not a good idea and really didn't want to go back into valves because we had just sold a valve company. That didn't make sense. But identified sort of AFib as a really interesting sort of space that was growing. And it didn't seem like technology was quite where it needed to be. And so pushed forward with developing what became Apama. But then midstream, we became aware of what Ardian was doing and renal denervation and hypertension treatment, with renal denervation. And then we looked at what we were doing. It was an ablation catheter with electrodes on a balloon and so forth. We said it would be so easy to take this sophisticated technology, downgrade it a little bit, and really use it for treating hypertension and doing renal denervation. So we actually did a pivot at that point in time. We convinced all our investors to invest in a new entity so that nobody would have a conflict with us down the road. And quickly funded the company and treated a bunch of patients with really good success and sold the company in 18 months.
Oh my God.
Before we went back and sort of reinvigorated Apama and moved that company forward.
I see. So this is the first time you're kind of moving two things forward at the same time, but you're kind of doing a two-step. You're emphasizing one and then moving.
Yeah, I mean, Shifamed. The idea of Shifamed is once we had done EPI, once we had done Sadra, I realized that my thing is all about innovation, and every time we start a company in the house and all that infrastructure was such a waste of time. That's when we set up the incubator, the innovation of Shifamed. And that's when we said, let's just establish an infrastructure that allows us to do multiple things at the same time. So while we were doing Apama and then shifted over to Maya, we also were doing Kalila, which is a steerable sheath. And then as we were doing Apama, started doing the ophthalmology company. So the idea of Shifamed is really to take the lessons learned from the history, what worked, and apply them in a sort of a process-oriented way so that we could do multiple things at the same time. And so we can leverage that same infrastructure in a very productive way without having to waste a lot of time. So when we come up with an idea, you're quickly productive. And we share, infrastructure, people, support staff, and so forth.
And do you have a framework where the staff in one venture somehow benefit if another venture does well?
No, we don't do that. We try to keep it really separate. It's important for us to. The reason that startups, or certainly medical device startups, succeed is because they can take risk. They're able to pivot and change. They're enabled. They're empowered, and their motivations are directly related to their actions. And we think it's really important. That's why startups do well. It's not part of a big organization. If I don't do so well, somebody else will do well, and I'll get my bonus because the company as a whole did well. So we wanted to keep that efficiency and accountability that startups have. And so the way we do things is that each set of employees are directly compensated and working focused on only the one company that they're part of. But what we do share is the infrastructure, the human resources, the finance and accounting, the intellectual property department, all of those things, the G&A functions are shared. Those, when an acquirer comes, they don't care about having more, an extra accounting person or two. That's not helpful to them. They don't need extra HR people. They just need the talent. They need the engineering. They need the know-how. And that's the part that is dedicated. And those are the people that are going to go be part of the acquiring company. And that's how we sort of split the economies of scale without losing the recipe for why startups are efficient.
Sure, magic. So you've exited from 5 companies in your former portfolio, all of them for 100 million plus, looks like. And now you've got 7 more on the go. So this is a whole other domain of complexity and value that you're entering now. Can you talk a little bit about how you picked those ones? What do you decide to double down on as a company?
So we follow the formula that I was sort of alluding to earlier. We start with a business opportunity. So one thing we do is we're a fast follower. We aim for opportunities that have been identified by others. And that way we don't take a lot of scientific risk because you can spend a lot of time on something and really have it not work out only at the very end. So we tend to be a fast follower in really innovating and being a second generation product. By then, strategics, investors are already convinced this is an interesting opportunity, so it really helps us out. The other thing we do is just the efficiency I described earlier. The G&A, when we start working on a project, we're immediately productive. The engineers don't have to worry about who's going to do HR and where's my paycheck, or is there a facility for me to do what I need to do. It's up and running as soon as we say it's go. And we do a lot of homework up front. And we often cancel project after spending a year or two or a couple $1 million and saying, look, it's not going to work. And so we're not afraid to take risks. We fail a lot at the beginning, but we do it on our own dime. It's my money that we lose, so that when we invite investors from the outside, they have less of the risk. But of course, then we get a lot of the early equity. So that's sort of the trade-off. We take the risk, we keep more of the equity, but we assure success for the investors.
And so a couple of questions. So if you could say sort of 4 or 5 of the sort of check boxes you would have at those early stages, how would you decide to get into something?
I look for that business opportunity and a way for us to sort of find a way through the IP, because we're always getting to these interesting competitive areas. So that's really, and is there likely to be a competitive process at the end? I start with the buyers. Who are the buyers? Are they likely to buy? When are they likely to buy? And what does it take for them to be able to do this and work backwards? Otherwise, it's really hard for us to really have success on a consistent basis. Okay.
And so you made a reference that you kill things from time to time. You've already spent $500,000 on it, say, and we were excited about the market. And then you have some sort of big meeting where you say, no, we're not going to do it.
Well, we don't have a big meeting. It becomes pretty obvious this is not a good idea. And when we're looking at new ideas, it's usually small teams, right? Mm-hmm. It's maybe an engineer or two, a marketing person, and 1 or 2 people within sort of my senior staff. It's not a very hard decision. And it's usually, I drive that decision because it becomes obvious, look, the buyers are not there, or we didn't find anything compelling. How are we differentiating ourselves from everybody else? So we don't do it.
So you have to make a lot of tough calls. And how many times have you had to make that call, do you think?
Oh, a lot of times. It's a great thing when you can make that call within the first couple of weeks, because then you haven't spent so much. Yeah, I think the difficult ones is when you've spent a year or two working on something, and ultimately, it's most of the time it's a business decision. I've learned one of the times everything looked good. There was an acquisition that had taken place by one of our competitors, and the space looked huge. Everything looked like it checked the boxes, and I said, okay, let's go and talk to the people in the strategics, the people who are selling the product, the people who are part of the big companies, and what do they think of all of this? And it's once we had that conversation, they didn't tell us don't do it, but they just described the dynamic, and it was very obvious that we shouldn't do this. And we stepped away from it. And I look back at those choices that we made; they were the right calls. Not that the space is not interesting, because I think it's going to be huge, but the timeline that we needed to really have a success was not going to work out, and that's turned out to be good.
That's remarkable. I know we, of course, in our business run across a lot of hopeful entrepreneurs and convince themselves that there's a great opportunity, but I sometimes wish that that we could formalize a little bit of what you're talking about to help them make the right decision sometimes. And, fall out of love with their own idea and to see it as an opportunity. And if this isn't the one, maybe there's other ones. So we're going to go to questions here in a couple minutes. I just want to, for our listeners, outline some of your companies. We've got Adona, which is a heart failure company, Atia Vision, which is accommodating intraocular lens, Myra Medical, which is glaucoma surgery, Nuvera Medical, which is intraoperative cardiovascular imaging, Supira, which is a percutaneous ventricular assist device, and Tioga Medical, which is mitral and tricuspid valves. That's quite the range of things you're working on right now. I almost can't believe the range. And a couple of them are outside of your sort of historical sweet spot of interventional cardiology. Can you tell us how you decided to broaden your company?
Well, a couple ways. As we were doing cardiovascular, which I like and I continue to think it's a very interesting space, it's going to continue to grow, and there's this competitive nature to the acquirers. I still wanted more diversification, and I didn't want to do 5 different things. And I also learned that once you know a space and establish a network with the acquirers as well as the physicians, that sophisticated knowledge helps you, work on the next, opportunity within that space. Mm-hmm. So we looked at ophthalmology. Ophthalmology is a pretty big space. Cataract surgery is one of the most commonly performed surgeries of any kind of surgery. Mm-hmm. So the opportunity is quite large. And our co-founder, Chief Technical Officer, Claudio, had been working in that space. And he said, look, here's what's going on. Here's what they're doing. We could do better, probably. It could be done better. And then one thing led to the other. And we said, yeah, let's just do it. Why not? Mm-hmm. It felt like we could do it. It would be easier. And it certainly turned out not quite as easy as we thought originally. But we still, mm-hmm. we think we have something really interesting in that space. And it's huge. And mm-hmm. it would impact so many patients. So that's mm-hmm. how we decided to go for it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, we're going to go to questions for our listeners. If you have questions, you can go to the Q&A tab and you can enter questions. And if there's not enough questions, I'll keep asking Amr myself. We've got about 12 minutes left on our schedule. So I believe for Mohammed's question, working in the medical device field, you got a lot of ideas, could be great products. How do you start exploring? I believe that was what I just asked you. So sorry, Mohammed, or I hope you're prescient. You've exactly asked the same question. Let me move to the next one. So Peter asks, Amr, have you ever abandoned an idea because the IP landscape was too crowded? Thank you.
I would say yes and no. I've abandoned ideas not because the IP landscape was too crowded, because we couldn't find our way through the IP landscape. So it's essentially, the answer is yes. We have decided not to move forward because we were just not creative enough to move forward. Often we get into spaces that look absolutely impenetrable, but sometimes you can find a way through it, and sometimes you cannot. Mm-hmm. So if you look at a really difficult IP space, and you don't find a way around it, usually there's also a business aspect of it that tells you that you shouldn't do this. It's not often that sort of becomes the total block, but yes, it has happened.
Interesting. I think that touches on an interesting idea as well. In entrepreneurship, a lot of the narrative is around never give up, but if you just persist and never give up, then that's the key to success. But in fact, what you're saying is giving up pretty easily early on is important. You don't give up on yourself, but you give up on any given venture.
Well, because we have choices. One of the things that sort of I like about what we do is that we're not so married to a particular opportunity that we have to push it forward, even if the timing on the opportunity is not so good. Mm-hmm. And by the way, if you decide not to move forward with something, doesn't mean that all is lost. It just means you put it aside for a while. You can always pick it back up later. Mm-hmm. That's certainly something we've done. It's just a lot of success depends on timing. And so it's really about how you manage that. And if you can do something else for a while before you jump back to something else, that could give you the time for success to happen in both.
Great. Okay, Kim R asks, what do you think about the remote monitoring space today? Inpatient, outpatient, and personal monitoring.
It's clear that this space is going to continue to grow. It's going to be a big space. I'm very interested in it myself, but it's also not easy to sort of, walk your way through it. And one of the issues with it is that it's not as traditional as, let's say, some of the things that we've done in the past, which are somewhat invasive procedures and minimally invasive, but they're still invasive. And the barrier to entry is rather high. And so it allows people who are focused and dedicated to sort of create, there's a regulatory aspects, there is a quality type system aspects, there's technology and patents and so forth. The challenge that I see with remote monitoring is that it's more similar to sort of consumer, where the barrier to entries may not be so high, and therefore the space is quite crowded with a lot of similar ideas. And not that it's not interesting, I don't think it makes it less interesting, but it has more of a behavior like a high-tech company. Ultimately, there's a few that are going to be hugely successful, but only because they moved really fast and raised a lot of money and managed to beat everybody else. But it's certainly, for me, I find it not as easy to discern that how you become one of those. It's a bit more difficult. Why did Uber became what they were? Not they were the only ones, but they eventually became one of the bigger ones in their space. But there's not going to be 5 Ubers. There's Ubers, there's Lyft, and so forth. So I would say that's, to me, is part of the interest and the challenge for remote monitoring.
It doesn't really fit the profile of what you seek, which is that you're differentiating on technology and that.
Well, it also gives you time to create that space between you and others. You almost very quickly have to scale and commercialize, which is a different skill set.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next question. Kareem M asks, you spoke about the key ingredients for success for a device incubator. How far should incubators take the development of a device before exiting?
So, I different groups do it in different ways. Our approach is we never let them go. They're always part of the system. It's, for us, the more groups that are helping, the better, because we keep them independent, but they leverage that infrastructure, the systems. So we use that to our advantage. Other groups, as soon as they have one company up and running, they may have a common infrastructure, but very quickly they push them out and want them to be completely independent, separate locations and whatnot. And the teams don't really talk to each other. We feel like there are advantages and to leverage common knowledge amongst the companies, and we do want to have one big campus. We think that's really helpful. So we have a different philosophy, and I think that is one of the differentiating things about our version of what an innovation hub incubator is.
And this question about how far to take it. Now, you said you want to exit pre-commercial, and you always have strong beliefs about that.
Yeah, in general, that is what we're aiming for. I am sure at some point in time we're gonna end up commercializing one of the devices and maybe take a company IPO. That is not what we're currently pursuing or actively saying to our investors. But I would expect that at some point in time this will be one of the things that we end up doing.
Yeah, that's pretty
when the IPO market is so compelling as it is right now, which is really super helpful, it's hard not to say, hey, you know what, let's keep it for longer and do better and execute faster still.
I'm curious in that if you're selling to a strategic that sees themselves as primarily a path to market, distribution, marketing strategy company, but you haven't really de-risked the market take-up of your product for them, how do you have those discussions?
Well, that's why we spend a lot of time doing a lot of homework early on, because that is what we do, is we select things or projects to work on, to move forward with, where the strategics are convinced already that it's what they need to have in their portfolio. That's why we spend so much time in the early stages trying to figure out what to work on. And that's why we end up in areas that are crowded, because we're not the only ones with that insight. We just need to execute faster. We try to execute better and faster.
And you also pick things that somebody will buy before you have to do a market validation.
Yeah, just the idea of being cardiovascular, so you're already ahead of the game, because that can be done.
Yes. Yes. Interesting. One question: are you interested in robotic surgery or automation of surgical processes?
Yeah, I am interested in it. Certainly, we'll be looking at it moving forward. And there's a lot to be. It's taken a while, but it's been a phenomenal success for the companies that are out there. Obviously, as you know them. So I think it is part of what we do today, and it's not gonna get less. It's gonna get more. So yeah, I'm definitely interested in that. I mean, listen, anything that affects what we do in technology and medicine, I'm going to be interested in. It's hard for me not to. I'm sort of, it's like there's too much candy on the table and I want to eat it all.
Of course. Okay, Michael asks, how is coronavirus affecting you?
Oh, it's affecting us quite a bit. Certainly at the beginning, more so than now. I think we've adapted to the new realities. People are working remotely a lot more than we used to. I used to sort of be totally against people even living remotely, and certainly for the software teams, that is a reality, and I'm okay with it at this point. In general, we would like still to people to come to the office, and if you're building stuff and testing things, you have to be in the office. There's no escape. So to the extent we can and be safe, we like people to be in the office. When we feel like the situation is not very good in the local area and the county and so forth, then we're going to, encourage a lot more of the remote work. So I don't think it's a rigid policy. I think it has to do with what the infection rate is and what the risks are. And we've set up the facilities with more separation. Everybody's wearing masks. Everybody's being tested. So it's a constant. You have to be vigilant all the time. And it's a healthcare issue, so we also have to deal with it. I would say we should be more sophisticated and more prudent than other companies, because that is also part of what we're about. We are about healthcare. So it has changed a lot of what we do. We spend a lot more time on Zoom than we ever did, and it's everybody else. And we did first in man on Zoom. So that was sort of a big thing for us. We needed to treat patients with a device for the ultrasound catheter for Novera, and we were not able to go to Paraguay. Travel was forbidden. We couldn't send our physicians, we couldn't send our engineers, but we were able to ship our catheters and ship our console. And we trained the physicians on Zoom, and then they performed the first 5 cases that were treated with our catheter were done via Zoom, and we were just watching it remotely. Which was fascinating. Of course, probably wouldn't do that with a valve, let's say, but a diagnostic, device that guides the procedure, certainly we feel comfortable to do that. So we've done things like that. We're a lot more aggressive that way. I mean, that is the idea of a startup that can take risks.
Remarkable. We've got a bunch more questions. We've got 2 more minutes, so I'll just cherry pick a couple here for you. What's your opinion of the current neurovascular space?
It's very hot. There's a lot of companies that are sort of being formed, and I think this is an area there's more awareness. The studies that have shown that treating early and more aggressively makes a big difference has been very helpful to this industry and to the patients. And surprisingly, still, there's many cities in the U.S. that don't have a neuro sort of intervention that's an emergency situation. And there's still too few centers that do this. And part of the solution is going to have to be education. Part of it is a system that sort of quickly brings patients to the hospitals, but technology, to be able to treat and reduce the skill level required for the physicians to do this, because there's not that many of them. So I think it's a very interesting space. I think you are seeing a lot of companies working in this space, and the growth is going to continue for the good of everybody. I mean, strokes are debilitating, and I'm very happy to see this. Sort of, development.
Great. Okay. I'm going to pick one last question from Michael N. Have you ever considered setting up an office in another city with a hot startup ecosystem?
Yes, I have. We're getting closer and closer to seriously sort of engage in that process. We're not doing any of that right now. I'm not sitting there planning it and plotting it right now, but certainly I'm interested in it, and hopefully we can sort of actually start planning for it sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm. Remarkable. Well, with that, I think it would be fun to talk to you for another hour. I think every time you answer a question, you give us another big insight. And it's got an insatiable appetite for that. And I know our audience does as well. But thank you so much for being with us today, Amr. And we'll put this online, and hopefully people enjoy it for years to come and benefit from your insights. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you,
Okay.
Scott.
Okay. Thank you. Talk to you later.